The pebbled beaches of Dieppe shimmer under the first pale light of morning waves, lapping gently against stones that have witnessed centuries of peaceful sunrises. In the distance, fishing boats bob quietly in the harbor where French merchant vessels once departed for New France, carrying dreams of colonial prosperity across the Atlantic. The salt air carries the scent of seaweed and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the town's bakeries where German soldiers have grown accustomed to their comfortable occupation duties. On this August morning, the seaside resort town feels as tranquil as any other day of the summer of 1942. Then from the darkness of the English Channel comes the low rumble of engines. The German sentries manning the clifftop positions squint through the pre-dawn gloom, their eyes adjusting to the sight of dark shapes materializing from the sea mist. Landing craft, dozens of them, cutting white wakes through the calm waters as they approach the beach. In the concrete bunkers of the 302nd Infantry Division machine gunners peer through their firing slits with the casual confidence of men who have spent 2 years watching this same coastline without incident. This was the moment that would forever shatter German illusions about their Canadian adversaries. Since the fall of France in 1940, the German Wehrmacht had settled into the comfortable rhythm of occupation duty along the Atlantic Wall. The 302nd Infantry Division, commanded by General Lieutenant Conrad Haas, represented the kind of static defensive formation that Hitler's planners believed could hold the coastline indefinitely. These were not the elite panzer divisions that had swept across Europe, nor the hardened mountain troops who had conquered Norway. They were occupation soldiers tasked with manning pillboxes and conducting routine patrols along beaches where the greatest excitement typically came from confiscating a fisherman's radio or questioning a suspicious civilian. The intelligence briefings had been reassuring. If the Allies ever attempted a cross-channel assault, German commanders expected it would come from the Americans, those untested industrial conscripts, or perhaps the war-weary British already bloodied by 3 years of conflict. The Canadians, they were colonial soldiers, garrison troops who had spent 2 years training in England without ever firing a shot in anger. The German assessment was clear. These were farmers and shopkeepers playing at war, led by officers whose greatest military experience came from peacetime maneuvers. General Haas himself had expressed this sentiment in his divisional briefings. The Canadians, he noted, represented the least experienced of all Allied formations, men who might have enthusiasm but lacked the tempering fire of combat. The 302nd Division's war diary from July 1942 recorded the prevailing attitude. Should the enemy attempt any significant landing operation, we expect them to employ their most experienced formations. The employment of colonial troops would indicate either desperation or a mere diversionary attack. On the morning of August 19th, as the first landing craft grounded on the shingle beach, German machine gunners opened fire with the methodical precision of men conducting target practice. The angle of fire was perfect. The interlocking fields established months earlier created killing zones that any military manual would describe as impregnable. The pebbled beach offered no cover. The seawall provided no protection from enfilading fire. This would be, German observers believed, a brief and one-sided engagement. Then the Canadians began to fight. The Royal Regiment of Canada, pinned against the seawall at Puys Beach, should have surrendered within minutes. Military doctrine suggested that troops caught in such an exposed position, suffering immediate casualties from concentrated machine gun fire, would quickly lose cohesion and seek to escape or capitulate. Instead, German gunners watched in growing amazement as individual Canadian soldiers continued to advance under impossible conditions. Men fell rows again, if able, and continued forward. When they could not advance, they returned fire from positions that offered no meaningful protection. Lieutenant Colonel Dollard Ménard of the Fusiliers Mont Royal struck by enemy fire the moment he stepped from his landing craft, continued to direct his men while bleeding from multiple wounds. The second the boat scraped the beach, I jumped out, he would later recall. I think I had taken 3 steps when the first one hit me. You say a bullet or a piece of Shrapnel hits you, but the word isn't right. They slam you the way a sledgehammer slams you. Yet Ménard did not fall back. He pressed forward and his men followed at Pourville. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment demonstrated the kind of leadership that German officers found bewildering when his men hesitated before crossing a bridge swept by machine gun fire. Merritt walked calmly into the killing zone, his helmet in his hand, calling out, "Come on over, there's nothing to it." This was not the behavior of inexperienced colonial troops. This was something else entirely. German machine gunners, accustomed to the predictable patterns of military engagement, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to conform to tactical expectations. Where European armies might probe for weakness, consolidate positions, or call for artillery support, the Canadians simply continued to attack. Wave after wave of men emerged from the landing craft, each group advancing over the bodies of their fallen comrades with the same grim determination. The sound that began to dominate the battle was not the crack of rifles or the chatter of machine guns, but the steady rhythm of Churchill tank engines. The 14th Army Tank Regiment, known as the Calgary Regiment, brought with them 58 Churchill tanks, the first operational deployment of Britain's newest armored fighting vehicle. As these 39-ton monsters emerged from their tank landing craft, German anti-tank gunners experienced a moment of genuine uncertainty. The Churchill was unlike anything they had previously encountered. Massively armored, powerfully armed, and seemingly impervious to the light anti-tank weapons that had sufficed against earlier Allied armor. But the beach itself became the tank's greatest enemy. The deep shingle and loose pebbles that made up Dieppe shore created a terrain unlike any encountered in previous armored operations. Churchill tanks designed for the firm ground of European battlefields found their tracks slipping and spinning in the unstable surface. 27 tanks made it off the landing craft, but 15 became hopelessly bogged down in the beach material, their crews trapped inside steel coffins under German fire. Yet even immobilized, these tank crews continued to fight. Unable to maneuver, they became stationary gun platforms, their 6-pounder guns and machine guns providing covering fire for the infantry assault. German observers watching from their cliff top positions witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of military behavior. These Canadian tank crews, knowing they could not escape, knowing their vehicles would become their tombs, continued to engage enemy positions until their ammunition was exhausted and their tanks were destroyed. The symbol that came to define the battle was the maple leaf ration pack, a small tin container that appeared everywhere. Among the Canadian dead, these modest metal containers, each bearing the distinctive red maple leaf of Canada, became scattered across the blood-soaked shingle like grotesque confetti. Inside each tin lay not just food, but a representation of everything the Canadian soldiers carried with them from their homeland: chocolate from Toronto factories, crackers from prairie wheat, preserved meat from Alberta ranches. This was abundance made portable. Democracy packaged for war. German soldiers, accustomed to ersatz coffee and diminishing rations, would later examine these captured supplies with fascination. The quality and quantity of the food seemed almost incomprehensible to men who had spent 3 years watching their own supply lines stretch thinner across occupied Europe. Here was evidence of an industrial capacity that could equip its soldiers not just adequately but lavishly. Each maple leaf ration tin represented a supply chain that stretched across the vast Canadian prairies, through factories that had never known bombing, along railways that had never been cut by partisan action. But more than material abundance, these ration tins represented something that German commanders found deeply unsettling: voluntary service. Unlike the Wehrmacht, built on conscription and maintained by harsh discipline, the Canadian forces were composed entirely of volunteers. Every man who died clutching a maple leaf ration tin had chosen to be there, had volunteered to cross an ocean to fight in a war that did not directly threaten his homeland. As the morning wore on, German commanders began to receive reports that contradicted everything they thought they knew about colonial fighting capacity. The Canadians were not breaking. They were not surrendering en masse despite impossible odds. Instead, they were demonstrating a tenacity that German officers associated only with their own elite formations. Men continued to fight with multiple wounds. Units maintained cohesion. Despite devastating casualties, individual soldiers advanced. Alone when their squads were wiped out by mid-morning, the nature of the battle had fundamentally changed. The German perception of their enemy. General Haas, monitoring the battle from his divisional headquarters, found himself revising his intelligence assessments in real time. These were not the untested garrison troops his briefings had described. The Canadians were fighting with a skill and determination that spoke of intensive training and unshakable morale. Their tactics, while costly, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of amphibious warfare principles. Their individual courage bordered on the incomprehensible. The German War Diary for August 19, 1942 recorded the shifting assessment: enemy forces demonstrate unexpected resilience. Canadian formations continue attack despite severe casualties. Resistance more determined than anticipated. What the clinical language of the official record could not capture was the psychological impact on German defenders, who had expected an easy victory at the Essex Scottish Regiment's landing point. German machine gunners found themselves running low on ammunition for the first time in the war. The sustained rate of fire required to stop the Canadian advance exceeded all planning assumptions. Reinforcement requests initially dismissed as unnecessary became urgent as German commanders realized they were facing not a probing raid, but a full-scale assault by determined, well-trained troops. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the treatment of Canadian prisoners. Initial German propaganda had prepared interrogators to question demoralized colonial conscripts who would readily provide intelligence about Allied plans. Instead, they encountered volunteers who maintained military discipline. Even in captivity, men who had chosen to fight and who remained defiant despite capture. As the tide rose on the afternoon of August 19th, carrying away the wounded with the waves, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in among German observers. The beaches of Dieppe were littered with the debris of modern warfare: destroyed Churchill tanks, abandoned landing craft, scattered weapons and equipment. But among this wreckage lay scattered hundreds of maple leaf ration tins, each one a small testament to the industrial might and democratic will that had brought these Canadian soldiers across an ocean to die on a French beach. Casualty figures told the story in stark numerical terms. Of the 4,963 Canadians who had embarked for Operation Jubilee, only 2,210 returned to England, and many of these were wounded. The 68% casualty rate represented one of the bloodiest single-day losses in Canadian military history, but for German commanders these numbers told a different story. They represented an enemy willing to accept catastrophic losses in pursuit of military objectives, an enemy whose industrial capacity could sustain such losses and whose population would continue to support such sacrifices. General Haas's post-battle report to Army Group West contained a remarkable admission for a victorious commander. The enemy demonstrated fighting qualities that exceeded all previous intelligence estimates. Canadian formations showed remarkable tenacity and individual courage. Future planning must account for significantly higher Allied capabilities than previously assessed. This was more than a tactical reassessment. It was a fundamental recognition that the war had entered a new phase. The comfortable assumptions that had sustained German confidence since 1940 that their enemies lacked the will and capability for sustained offensive operations lay shattered among the pebbles of Dieppe Beach, alongside the maple leaf ration tins. The Dieppe raid represented a profound transformation in the German understanding of the war they were fighting. What had begun as a simple defensive action against colonial troops had evolved into a revelation about the nature of their opposition. The Canadians had demonstrated that the Atlantic Wall, despite its impressive fortifications, could be assaulted by determined troops willing to accept massive casualties. More importantly, they had shown that the Western Allies possessed formations capable of the kind of sustained offensive action that German planning had dismissed as impossible. The psychological impact extended beyond military circles. German soldiers who had witnessed the Canadian assault carried stories of individual courage and collective determination that challenged Nazi propaganda about the fighting qualities of democratic armies. These men had seen enemy soldiers advance under impossible conditions, had watched tank crews fight to the death in immobilized vehicles, had captured prisoners who maintained military bearing despite certain captivity. The maple leaf ration tins scattered across the battlefield, like the calling cards of industrial democracy, became symbols of something German soldiers found increasingly difficult to dismiss. Each tin represented not just abundant food, but an economic system that could sustain such abundance, while simultaneously producing the ships, tanks, aircraft, and weapons necessary for global warfare. This was an enemy that could absorb the losses at Dieppe and return with greater force, better equipment, and harder-won experience. In the months following Dieppe, German defensive planning underwent subtle but significant changes. Assumption that Allied amphibious assaults would be tentative probing actions was abandoned. The belief that colonial troops lacked the fighting spirit of European armies was quietly discarded. The comfortable notion that the Atlantic Wall represented an impregnable barrier was replaced by urgent requests for additional fortifications, more troops, and better weapons. Impact of this transformation would become evident 2 years later when Allied forces returned to the French coast. The lessons learned from Canadian blood on Dieppe Beach informed every aspect of the D-Day, planning the need for overwhelming naval gunfire support, the importance of air superiority, the necessity of specialized equipment for beach assaults, and the requirement for sustained follow-up operations. The sacrifice at Dieppe had purchased knowledge that made victory in Normandy possible, but perhaps most importantly, Dieppe had demonstrated to both sides the true character of the conflict they were engaged in. This was not a war that could be won through tactical superiority or strategic brilliance alone. It was a war of industrial capacity and national will, a contest between competing visions of human organization and social structure. The maple leaf ration tins scattered among the dead represented more than individual sacrifice. They symbolized a society's commitment to principles worth dying for. Beaches of Dieppe run red with more than blood. They flow with the ebbing tide of German confidence and the rising certainty of Allied determination. In the end, the German laughter that had greeted news of the Canadian assault died away among the cliffs of Dieppe, replaced by the sober recognition that they faced an enemy unlike any they had previously encountered. The colonial farmers and shopkeepers had proven themselves warriors of the highest caliber, men whose democratic convictions translated into battlefield courage that even veteran German officers found worthy of respect. Maple leaf ration tins, those small symbols of abundance and choice, would outlast the temporary triumph of German arms. They represented not just the Canada that had sent these men to die, but the larger community of democratic nations, whose industrial might and popular will would ultimately prove unstoppable. Each tin bore witness to the fundamental truth that free societies, when fully mobilized, possess resources, moral as well as material, that authoritarian regimes cannot match. On August 19, 1942, German commanders learned that they were not fighting garrison troops or reluctant conscripts. They were fighting the advance guard of democracy itself, men who had crossed an ocean not for conquest or glory, but for the simple principle that free peoples must stand together or fall separately. The laughter that had echoed from German command posts in the early morning hours gave way to the grim recognition that the war they thought they were winning had only just begun. Tide that carried away the Canadian wounded also carried away the last vestiges of German complacency. In its place rose an understanding that would haunt German planning for the remainder of the war. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in the factories and farms of North America, An industrial democracy was converting its vast resources into instruments of liberation. And no amount of concrete fortifications or tactical brilliance would be sufficient to stop what was coming. The maple leaf ration tins, scattered like seeds among the pebbles of Dieppe, had planted a truth that would bloom into victory, that free men fighting for principles they chose to embrace possess a strength that tyrants can never fully comprehend and can never ultimately defeat.